I'm going to talk a little bit today about the values that we share and how we can use them to have more productive conversations about immigration with people who might disagree with us. And I'm going to start off actually by showing you all a short video. It's about 4 minutes long. It's an edited version of a video that actually the BBC put together. I believe now it was either early this year or last year, about a small town in Washington State that voted for Trump and is now experiencing sort of the fallout from the Trump immigration policies. So I'm going to show that to you, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the values that were in the video and that we've discovered can be particularly helpful when talking about immigration. So I will go ahead and get that started.
This year, what we've noticed is a lot of people who have been in our community for a number of years have been arrested and detained by ICE. We're talking people that have been here sometimes 10, 12, even more years. So it's impacting the fisheries, the cannery workers, the cranberry bogs. Those are all very much heavily dependent upon migrant workers. But even more so than that, I think people have just been emotionally in turmoil because they've seen people that they've known for years, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, people that have gone to church with, those kind of things. Kids are in school together, are just gone.
We've lost about 25 students. We're a district of just a little over 1,000 kids. So for a district our size, it's significant. You know, that's a whole classroom full of kids, basically.
There was just this gigantic herd of people before we left. And I remember just seeing half the people crying.
Yeah, there was like a bunch of people just like crying. A couple days before he left, he came over to my house, and I remember just hanging out with him and thinking that like I might not see him again.
It's the empty seat where that kid was, and hard to explain to classrooms, not understanding how their country is doing this. It added this sense of fear. And so it becomes an emotional, kind of an emotional roller coaster for the kids.
They're taking the easy targets. I've been told people are just going to work for the day and ICE is there waiting for them when they arrive at work. And it's frustrating because they have not yet been able to tell us names of people that they're taking away or any details. So sometimes we've had cases where maybe somebody is missing and we don't know if they were taken by ICE or if they're actually a missing person. You know, I have no problem whatsoever in seeing people that are committing crimes deported. Since I've been sheriff in the last 7 years, I think they've only taken people about a half dozen times from our jail facility.
We've had stories that, you know, people will, you know, kind of disappear and then, you know, actually leave the community and kind of go underground. You literally cannot replace them.
It's easy to hear sound bites and say, yes, that's great policy. It's different when you're implementing it and you start seeing, now, wait a minute, this is actually affecting these people's lives, and that I didn't sign up for this. And shame on me for being short-sighted about it. Okay, I mean, fine, but it's not just. It's not just to me.
So what I find really fascinating about that video and why I thought it would be a powerful one to start with today is not only is it a story about a part of the country that voted for Trump where people
our Republicans who are really keenly feeling the effects of his immigration policies. But also that it displays a lot of the values that they as Americans share with the rest of us that are particularly important, I think, to cue when you're talking about immigration. So let me just back up for a second and talk about what values are and what they're good for. So these are these sort of cultural ideals that all of us have as Americans. They're ideas about who we are and what our society represents. So things like justice, equality, opportunity for all, fairness, and the good thing about values is that they help establish why a social issue is important, not just for that particular group, but for all of us. So they really prime people to think about things in a collective way, collective responsibility, but also collective benefits, and they tap into our emotions. So they get people interested, they raise their concern, and ideally they also give people a way of thinking that we can solve problems. So I'm going to talk about the values that we found in our research were particularly effective for talking about immigration, and that I think all of us can use in sort of our daily communications with people who might not agree with us, but who do share these same values with us. So the first one, and we found this to be very effective, and I think we've seen quite a bit of it in our discourse recently, and I think that you saw it in that video as well, is the idea of sort of human dignity and moral obligation. So we know from our research that Americans have a deep belief that people are people and that we treat people with respect. That's who we are as Americans. And what this sets up for people when you're talking about immigration is the idea that, everyone deserves our compassion and our respect, regardless of where they're born. So this, again, cues that thinking about collective responsibility and the idea that we have an obligation to fulfill to other people, that we have a shared humanity, and also that there's, a relationship between morality and our systems and structures. It's not just about individual morality, it's about it's one of the values that's built into our society and should be built into all of our social structures. What I find also very interesting about this particular value is that when we did our testing to see what values worked, we found that human dignity value worked much better than a rights-based argument when talking about immigrants' community contribution to society. So I'll give you a couple specific examples of what we tested. So you can see in the green that, that the human dignity value was iterated as no matter where we're born, we all deserve to be treated with kindness and respect. Whereas rights is about no matter where we're born, we're guaranteed basic rights. And as you can see, we found that trying to use a rights-based argument really did not move people towards understanding what immigrants contribute to our society. Human dignity was much, much more effective. And this is not to say you should never talk about human rights when talking about immigration. It's just that you shouldn't lead with it. It's not the value that you should use, I think, particularly with people who are not sure how they feel about immigration or maybe somewhat opposed to immigration. A rights-based argument is not what's going to get them to listen to you and potentially take your argument seriously. The next value that we found was very effective was the idea of prosperity. And more specifically, a shared prosperity. All of us as Americans do want our country to be prosperous, and, kind of playing on that idea that we all collectively benefit from welcoming immigrants into our country, that their talents and their skills contribute. And importantly, that their prosperity isn't just, this is not just economic prosperity, because certainly immigrants do contribute to our economy, but they contribute to our culture, right? So they add to our culture. And that's another way to talk about sort of social prosperity. And, you know, the importance of ensuring that we need an immigration system that works so that we all collectively benefit and prosper is another good argument to make to sort of bring people into a more productive discussion about immigration. The third value that we recommend is the value of pragmatism. And interestingly, we actually found in our research that when there's pushback against, you know, the human dignity argument or the prosperity argument, coming back with a pragmatic value actually works very well. We, as Americans, think that we are a pragmatic people, right? We have a lot of common sense. And so talking about the ways in which a working immigration system is practical, that it makes sense, that some of the policies that are being proposed or enacted right now, like building a wall on the border, just doesn't make any common sense. It's expensive. It's not going to prevent immigration. But then we can create a working system because we are pragmatic people as Americans is another way to talk about immigration that we found particularly effective when you get that pushback. So here are just a couple of more specific examples of these values being used. So this is a tweet from Chris Murphy about that was framed with moral obligation. And what I love about this tweet, the reason I chose it was that he talks about how separating families cuts at the moral heart of who we are as a country, right? So calling on our responsibility and obligation as moral people to address this issue is really critical. And I think it's, you know, it's not a coincidence that so many faith communities are very heavily involved with refugee resettlement and other immigration activism or support. It's because of that moral obligation to help the stranger. Here's another couple of really interesting, I thought, articles about where they took that moral obligation. Again, this is looking at the border, family separation and building a wall, and they paired the moral obligation with the pragmatism. So talking about how family separation, building a wall, isn't just immoral, but it's actually ineffective and doesn't make any sense. So it's a, you know, putting these two values together and really bringing people in by cueing their thinking about how people are people and deserve dignity and respect and compassion, and are pragmatic people who can tackle problems in better, more common sense ways. And then here's an example of an article that was framed with prosperity. And actually I put the bottom little quote at the top because it's a little small and hard to read. And it's from last year, actually right before Thanksgiving, saying, "Let's give thanks for immigrants. Immigrants and diversity have powered growth of America and its cities going back to the 19th century." So I think that one thing that sometimes we can fall into is talking about how immigrants are hardworking, you know, accidentally cueing people's thinking about immigrants taking our jobs. And so when we talk about that shared prosperity and the ways in which immigrants have powered our growth or powered our economy, and we collectively benefit, is a good way to sort of pivot away or take a bridge from that thinking, that zero-sum thinking about immigration. So to end, I'm just going to offer up a few of our recommendations about things that you want to avoid when you're talking about immigration and things that you want to advance that we found particularly useful based on our research. This is what it suggests. So as I said, don't talk about immigrants' rights, you know, at the beginning. You can discuss it, but don't use it as your value, and instead talk about our sort of human dignity and our shared values and our moral obligations. An important one is not talking about undocumented immigrants as coming out of the shadows. We know from our research that cues really unproductive thinking about what lives in shadows. Criminals live in shadows, monsters live in shadows, bad things come out of shadows. So we don't want to cue that kind of thinking. Instead, we should talk about the fact that we have an outdated immigration system that then leads to people being undocumented. Trying to stay away from talking about particular groups of immigrants as worthy and deserving, and instead talking about an immigration system that allows all immigrants to contribute. There's a lot of discussion in the media about our immigration system being broken, which, it's certainly not working very well, but we need to make the more positive case that change is actually feasible, that we can do this. Again, that pragmatism, because when you say something is broken, people have a hard time imagining how it might be fixed, and they can get very fatalistic. Important thing for whenever presenting any arguments is not assuming people can interpret your data. They don't speak for themselves. So, talking about how data suggests that immigration moves us towards shared prosperity is one way to frame your data that's effective. This isn't just a problem for immigrants, and that's something I really love about that video, right? So the whole community was suffering because of the immigration policies that have been enacted recently. And I thought it was interesting that the focus wasn't even on the immigrants themselves. It was on the people that were left behind, the American citizens that were left behind, which is a different way of sort of framing the immigration issue and what's going on. And speaks to the fact that this is a collective issue for all of us. If we lose immigrants in our society, our shared prosperity suffers. So thinking about the ways when you're having these conversations of discussing the sort of collective responsibilities and also collective benefits. And then the last thing, and I'm about to end, is solutions. Never forget to give people solutions, because otherwise they're going to just make them up for themselves, and they might not be the solutions you were trying to point them to.